The Sterile Imagination. How a Civilization Loses the Will to Bless Life Before It Loses the Children Themselves. By Elias Winter. May 7th, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. The Writer Who Could Not Bless. I came across a certain kind of writer online. He was not stupid. That must be said first, because stupidity would have made the encounter easier. One can dismiss stupidity without cost. But this was not stupidity. It was intelligence turned against elevation. He wrote in fragments, little sentences, jokes that seemed at first like jokes, and then, after a moment, like refusals. Ruins, animals, plumbing, waste, dead malls, broken systems, cheap materials, failed transcendence, literary residue, the private machinery by which a man proves that nothing has escaped the conditions of its making. His instinct was not simply to lie. That too would have been easier. He saw something true about the age, its fraud, inflated language, literary priesthoods, moral branding, compromised platforms, and economies of prestige pretending to be witness. He knew that poems circulate through systems. He knew that suffering can be aestheticized. He knew that prophecy can become a career style. He knew that the sacred is often carried into the room by people who would also like subscribers, praise, and favorable placement in the feed. This was not nothing. But everything he touched came out smaller. A prayer became a posture. A wound became material. A soul became machinery. The vertical had to be pulled down into the parking lot before it made any claim. The fire had to be surrounded by commentary, explaining its funding structure, class position, aesthetic suspiciousness, probable narcissism, and compromised medium of circulation. It was not merely criticism. Criticism still believes something may be saved from error. This was deflation, the repeated act by which anything that rose was made ridiculous before it could require reverence. At first I was irritated, then I was disturbed. Then I began to understand that I had not merely encountered a man, I had encountered a type. The age has produced many such people. Some are writers, some are critics, some are academics, some are comedians, some are posters, some are merely intelligent citizens who have learned to survive disappointment by ensuring that nothing ever becomes too beautiful in their presence. They are not without gifts. Often they are sensitive. They see through fraud quickly. They smell sanctimony before others do. They have been wounded by false grandeur, by institutions that preached justice while practicing hierarchy, by culture industries that rewarded the counterfeit soul, by political language so compromised that sincerity began to sound like collaboration. Their suspicion is not baseless. But suspicion can become a home. And a person who lives too long inside suspicion eventually loses the ability to receive. That was what unsettled me. Not that he mocked. Mockery has its uses. Not that he refused false piety. False piety deserves refusal. What unsettled me was the absence of blessing. He had not lost language. He had lost benediction. And once I saw this in him, I began to see it elsewhere. In politics, dating, family life, institutional speech, exhausted cities, empty nurseries renamed as offices, young people joking about never having children, not always because they hate children, but because the future has become too difficult to speak of without embarrassment. I began to wonder whether the demographic crisis was also the public measurement of a prior spiritual event. Maybe a civilization does not first stop having children. Maybe first it loses the ability to bless. 2. The imagination before the cradle. We usually speak of fertility in numbers. Birth rates fall. Populations age. Schools consolidate. Maternity wards close. Pension systems strain. Fewer young workers support more retirees. Homes that might have held children become offices, guest rooms, storage rooms, rooms of deferred life. Governments form committees. Economists produce charts. Commentators blame housing, childcare, feminism, capitalism, secularization, dating apps, men, women, work, debt, climate anxiety, contraception, selfishness, or some insufficiently obedient generation. Many of these explanations are partly true. Children have become expensive. Housing has become punishing. Work has invaded the household. Childcare can consume the second income it was supposed to enable. Medical systems turn birth into financial exposure. Cities are built for commuters and capital, not strollers and grandparents. Dating has been gamified. Pornography has deformed desire. Men and women often meet each other across the battlefield of accumulated grievance. The old kinship structures have weakened. Religion no longer holds a shared canopy over time. Marriage arrives late, if it arrives at all. The household is asked to absorb costs that the entire social order helped create. So, yes, the material conditions matter. They matter morally, not merely statistically. A young couple hesitating before children because rent is impossible, child care is ruinous, work is precarious, health care is frightening, and parents live far away is not necessarily spiritually barren. They may be exercising responsibility under conditions arranged against them. A woman who refuses motherhood because the available version would erase her, impoverish her, or bind her to an unreliable man is not proof of civilizational decadence. A man who cannot imagine fatherhood because he has never seen stable fatherhood may be wounded before he is selfish. The material story must not be dismissed as an excuse, but material conditions do not explain everything. There have been children in famine, war, exile, plague, poverty, occupation, migration, and ruins. This fact should not be sentimentalized. It is not an argument against policy, housing, medical care, child care, or paid leave. It is not a command that people reproduce inside despair. It is simply a reminder that birth has never required history to become safe. Something else must be present for life to be handed forward. A society must believe, at some level deeper than optimism, that time remains worthy of trust. It must believe that the child is not merely a future taxpayer, not merely a lifestyle accessory, not merely a burden on carbon budgets, not merely an interruption of selfhood, not merely a private consumer choice, but a bearer of continuity. Demographic decline is the measurable symptom. The sterile imagination is the prior atmosphere. One appears in records. The other appears in jokes, hesitations, postponed marriages, sterile eroticism, vanished rituals, institutions that administer but do not initiate, and the quiet inability to picture the future as inheritance rather than bill. The womb does not close first. The imagination does. A people may still have bodies capable of reproduction, clinics, bedrooms, dating apps, medical technologies, tax credits, and policy proposals. Yet if the future no longer appears as welcome, if the child no longer appears as blessing, if continuity feels like complicity, if every tradition is contamination and every obligation a trap, then even generous reforms arrive late to a soul already unconvinced. This is why the fertility crisis cannot be understood only through economics. Economics explains why children became difficult. Metaphysics explains why difficulty became final. The modern world has not simply made children expensive. It has made the future suspect. And when the future becomes suspect, birth becomes morally complicated in a new way. The question is no longer only, can we afford a child? It becomes, can we justify bringing someone into this? Into climate instability, debt, war, loneliness, technological derangement, institutional collapse, algorithmic childhood, pornography, school shootings, political madness, aging parents, broken communities, poisoned language, and a culture that cannot promise meaning without irony? The question is understandable. But when a civilization asks it too often and answers it too darkly, the cradle empties. Not because people have become uniquely selfish, because they have lost the grammar of blessing. 3. The lost grammar of "and still." The most fertile phrase in a civilization may be "and still." The world is broken, and still. Love wounds, and still. Institutions fail, and still. Language is contaminated, and still. The body ages, and still. The future is uncertain, and still. A fertile civilization does not require innocence. It is not fertile because it has failed to notice death. It is fertile because death has not acquired final authority over its imagination. This is where modern consciousness often fails. It mistakes knowledge of tragedy for permission to stop blessing. It says, because the world is compromised, we must not transmit. Because tradition has been abused, we must not inherit. Because nations commit violence, we must not love place. Because families wound children, we must not risk family. Because religion has served power, we must not pray. Because language is manipulated, we must not speak vertically. Because desire has been corrupted, we must not covenant. Because children suffer, we must not welcome them. The movement is always the same. The world is broken, therefore. The fertile soul says, the world is broken, and still. This is not denial. Denial says the darkness is not real. Fertility says the darkness is real and not sovereign. The difference is everything. A people can survive grief if it retains the power to bless through grief. It can survive corruption if it retains the power to build without innocence. It can survive historical knowledge if that knowledge becomes responsibility rather than paralysis. But when knowledge becomes total suspicion, when every inheritance is prosecuted until nothing remains transmissible, when every sacred word is reduced before it can be spoken, then the future begins to lose its advocates. A child is the most radical and still. Not because everyone must have one. Not because reproduction solves the soul. Not because those without children are lesser participants in life. But because every child declares, without argument, that time has not been fully condemned. A child says something may continue. That is why sterile cultures often find children embarrassing. Children are noisy refutations of managed despair. They interrupt irony. They require adults to become less interesting to themselves. They do not care about our theories of collapse. They ask to be fed, held, taught, forgiven, protected, and answered. They expose whether love has become a posture or remains an obligation. A civilization that cannot say "and still" will eventually find children intolerable, even if it sentimentalizes them in advertising. It will call them too expensive, too risky, too limiting, too morally fraught, too environmentally costly, too disruptive, too much. Sometimes these concerns will be real, but underneath them, another sentence will be hiding. We no longer know how to bless what makes claims on us. This is the sterile imagination. 4. 6 marks of the sterile imagination. 1. the inability to bless the future. The first sign is the loss of a simple gesture, blessing the future. The future no longer appears as child, garden, home, school, table, apprenticeship, harvest, promise, repair, or song passed down. It appears as debt, climate, automation, collapse, medical cost, political violence, and technological exposure. It arrives not as inheritance, but as threat. This does not happen without reason. The future has indeed been mortgaged. Governments have borrowed against it. Corporations have extracted from it. Older generations have often consumed what younger ones must repay. The young are not wrong to feel that they have inherited liabilities disguised as civilization. But when the future is imagined only as injury, birth becomes nearly unintelligible. Why invite someone into a burning house? Why hand life forward if life is mostly exposure? Why give a child to time if time itself feels hostile? The fertile answer is not that the house is not burning. It is that a burning house still contains people worth saving, rooms worth rebuilding, names worth remembering, and children who should not be reduced to the fire they inherit. A civilization loses fertility when it can no longer bless what it cannot guarantee. 2. Suspicion of continuity. The second mark is suspicion of continuity. Every inheritance arrives under interrogation. Family is trauma. Nation is violence. Religion is manipulation. Tradition is oppression. Language is propaganda. Sex is power. Beauty is hierarchy. Motherhood is coercion. Fatherhood is patriarchy. Authority is abuse. Memory is myth. Belonging is exclusion. Civilization is merely a more elegant word for domination. Again, there is truth here. Families do wound. Nations do lie. Religions have served empires. Traditions have protected cruelty. Language is used to conceal violence. Beauty is often distributed through hierarchy. Motherhood has been coerced. Fatherhood has been corrupted. Authority has abused. Belonging has excluded. A mature civilization must be able to judge its inheritances, but judgment is not the same as annihilation. When critique becomes total, nothing can be handed down. The young inherit not a tradition purified by repentance, but a wasteland of prosecuted symbols. They are told that nearly everything that formed their ancestors is suspect, and then they are asked to form themselves out of choice, media, therapy, consumption, and personal branding. This is too much freedom and too little inheritance. Continuity does not require innocence. It requires repentance, selection, gratitude, and courage. A living tradition is not one that has never sinned. It is one that can confess, repair, and continue without pretending that contamination is identical to nullification. Sterility begins when a people can expose the past but cannot receive anything from it. 3. Irony replacing reverence. The third mark is the replacement of reverence by irony. Reverence is not gullibility. It is the capacity to let something stand before us long enough to make a claim. A child, a body, a dead ancestor, a prayer, a landscape, a sentence, a face, a truth not yet reduced to its conditions. Irony, at its best, protects against fraud. It punctures inflated authority. It keeps the idol from becoming too comfortable. It reminds prophets that some prophets are performers and some altars are theater sets. But irony becomes sterile when it moves from instrument to atmosphere. A person ruled by irony must judge before he can be moved. He must create distance before vulnerability can enter. He must lower the thing before it has time to lift him. This produces a strange form of safety. He cannot be easily fooled because he never fully believes. He cannot be humiliated by hope because he mocks hope first. He cannot be disappointed by beauty because beauty has already been made suspicious. Such a person may be clever. He may even be right, often, but he cannot bless. A culture dominated by irony becomes highly responsive and spiritually uninhabitable. It produces jokes faster than vows, takes faster than commitments, critique faster than repair. Everything is scanned for cringe. Every elevated phrase is interrogated for hidden careerism. Every moral claim is treated as branding. Every sincere gesture is read as performance unless sufficiently coated in self-contempt. The ironic civilization does not forbid love. It makes love embarrassing. 4. Adulthood as self-optimization. The fourth mark is the collapse of adulthood into self-optimization. In a fertile culture, adulthood is stewardship. The adult receives a world he did not make and prepares it for those who did not ask to come. He belongs to children, elders, neighbors, institutions, the dead, the unborn, the land, the language, the household, the fragile continuities by which life becomes more than consumption. In a sterile culture, adulthood becomes a project of the self. Optimize the body. Optimize the career. Optimize the brand. Optimize the trauma narrative. Optimize the apartment. Optimize the feed. Optimize the dating profile. Optimize the sleep, the macros, the mobility, the productivity stack, the therapeutic vocabulary, the boundaries, the experiences, the aesthetic, the story. None of these things is evil in itself. A person should care for the body. Work matters. Healing matters. Boundaries can be necessary. But a life organized entirely around self-optimization becomes curiously barren. The self becomes the estate. There is no heir because the self has become both property and project. The adult is no longer ancestor in training. He is a curator of his own continuation. Even spirituality becomes another layer of self-management. Even politics becomes identity maintenance. Even love becomes a mirror in which the self asks whether it is being adequately affirmed, stimulated, protected, or expanded. Children are difficult for such a world because children do not optimize the self. They interrupt it. They disorder the schedule, the body, the sleep, the romance, the career, the apartment, the disposable income, the fantasy of sovereign availability. They force adulthood out of self-cultivation and into stewardship. That is why a culture can praise growth endlessly while becoming unable to grow anything beyond the self. 5. Fear of embodiment. The fifth mark is fear of embodiment. Children are not ideas. They arrive as bodies. Pregnancy, birth, blood, milk, crying, fever, diapers, touch, exhaustion, appetite, dependence, illness, teeth, sleep deprivation, cost, risk, vulnerability. They make philosophy smell like laundry. They convert love into logistics. A disembodied culture experiences this as invasion. We increasingly live through screens, abstractions, remote work, pornography, bureaucratic systems, algorithmic feeds, synthetic images, quantified health, financial instruments, and language detached from face-to-face consequence. The body is managed, displayed, optimized, medicated, edited, filtered, enhanced, hidden, sold, disciplined, and feared. To have a child is to surrender to embodiment in one of its most radical forms. This is not merely difficult. It is offensive to a culture that has grown accustomed to control without contact. Artificial intelligence enters this scene with almost perfect symbolic timing. It did not cause the fertility crisis, and it will not explain it by itself. Housing, work, gender, religion, education, urbanization, contraception, and political economy matter far more directly. But AI belongs to the imagination of the crisis because it offers a fantasy already latent in the age. Intelligence without birth, output without childhood, fluency without flesh, assistance without dependency, creation without pregnancy, continuation without kinship. A tired civilization may be tempted to believe that productivity can substitute for renewal. AI may do much good. It may reduce administrative burden, accelerate medicine, support teachers, help caregivers, extend human capability. But it becomes dangerous when it is asked to soothe the wound left by a thinning human world. It can generate language. It cannot remember its grandmother. It cannot be held as an infant. It cannot bury its father. It cannot forgive a son. It cannot turn a household toward the future by existing as a claim upon love. Embodiment is not an inefficiency in civilization. It is the medium through which civilization remains human. 6. Eros without generativity. The sixth mark is eros detached from generativity. This must be said carefully. Generativity is not reducible to biological reproduction. Gay people can be spiritually fertile. Celibate people can be spiritually fertile. Infertile people can be spiritually fertile. Aunts, uncles, teachers, mentors, priests, artists, neighbors, doctors, nurses, friends, and strangers can all participate in the handing forward of life. Nor is every sexual act required to justify itself by reproduction. Such a view is too narrow for the complexity of love, tenderness, play, union, and the body's languages. But eros becomes sterile when it loses all relation to tenderness, covenant, hospitality, risk, and future. In a sterile culture, sex becomes performance, validation, consumption, domination, anesthesia, identity, content, competition, proof of desirability, or escape from the unbearable self. Bodies meet without worlds forming around them. Desire becomes intense, but non-transmissive. It produces memory without continuity, climax without covenant, exposure without recognition. Pornography is the great teacher of sterile eros. Infinite bodies, infinite novelty, no claim, no mutuality, no time, no aging, no awkward breakfast, no family, no wound that must be answered, no face that remains after the scene ends. The most extreme forms of erotic self-destruction reveal the structure plainly. Infinite voltage, zero world. The body is flooded with sensation, yet nothing is welcomed. No household is formed. No tenderness is sustained. No future is blessed. The erotic faculty, which might have opened the person toward another, is trapped inside a closed circuit of image, chemistry, shame, and repetition. This is not only moral failure, it is sorrow. A civilization can be sexually saturated and spiritually barren. It can speak endlessly of desire while losing the conditions under which desire becomes fruitful. It can confuse access with intimacy, novelty with abundance, visibility with being wanted, and exposure with love. Eros is spiritually fertile when it makes the world more hospitable to life, whether through children, care, art, fidelity, friendship, protection, or beauty. It is sterile when it consumes the future in order to intensify the present. 5. Demography as the public record of what we serve. Demography is not theology in the simple sense. Birth rates do not tell us who is virtuous. High fertility can coexist with poverty, coercion, patriarchy, instability, lack of contraception, religious pressure, and the absence of meaningful choice. Low fertility can coexist with tenderness, responsibility, education, women's freedom, ecological concern, moral seriousness, and deeply generative childless lives. A humane argument must admit this. Still, demography reveals something. It reveals what a society makes possible. It reveals what a society rewards, postpones, burdens, subsidizes, mocks, privatizes, and treats as sacred. It reveals whether adulthood has been made habitable. It reveals whether the old are honored without devouring the young. It reveals whether the young are given enough material and spiritual ground to form households. It reveals whether the future is loved in practice or merely invoked in speeches. A society in which fewer and fewer people feel able or willing to welcome children is telling us something. It may be telling us that housing is broken, that work is inhuman, that men and women do not trust one another, that care is unsupported, that elders have consumed the future, that communities are thin, that religion has weakened, that children have become private luxuries rather than public goods. That time itself no longer feels hospitable. The material and metaphysical are not enemies here. They are intertwined. Housing policy is fertility policy. Work culture is fertility policy. Healthcare is fertility policy. Pornography is fertility policy. Education is fertility policy. Elder care financing is fertility policy. Dating culture is fertility policy. Language is fertility policy. A society that tells young adults to optimize themselves, move constantly, remain employable, brand their trauma, delay commitment, consume erotic novelty, distrust inheritance, fear embodiment, and interpret every obligation as a threat should not be surprised when they hesitate to become parents. It has catechized them into sterility and then asked why the nursery is empty. But the world is complicated. Some low-fertility countries retain strong family cultures, but face crushing urban costs, gender role conflicts, and work demands. Some higher fertility societies do not represent spiritual health, but economic necessity or constrained choice. Some religious communities have more children because they retain a grammar of blessing. Others may do so because dissent is costly. Some secular people have few or no children, yet pour themselves into teaching, art, medicine, friendship, and care. The point is not to turn fertility into a moral scoreboard. The point is to recognize that numbers alone cannot explain the inner weather of refusal, hesitation, exhaustion, and loss of confidence in transmission. No single factor explains the decline, but the sterile imagination names the atmosphere in which all the factors become harder to resist. 6. The false exits. There are 3 false exits from this sterility. The first is nostalgia. Nostalgia says, return. Bring back the old village, the old household, the old faith, the old marriage pattern, the old gender order, the old neighborhood, the old authority, the old confidence, the old fertility. It looks backward and mistakes memory for responsibility. There are things worth recovering. The past contained forms of wisdom. Modern life has discarded too cheaply. Intergenerational households, shared rituals, thicker communities, embodied worship, limits on market logic, respect for parents, seriousness about marriage, acceptance that children require sacrifice, reverence for the dead. But the old village cannot be summoned back by longing. Some of its warmth was purchased by constraint. Some of its order concealed violence. Some of its fertility depended on women having fewer choices, children having fewer protections, outsiders having fewer claims, and silence being mistaken for peace. A serious future must receive the past without becoming its ventriloquist. The second false exit is automation. Automation says, solve the arithmetic without renewing the soul. If there are fewer workers, machines will work. If there are fewer caregivers, robots will assist. If there are fewer teachers, software will tutor. If there are fewer children, productivity will compensate. If the human base shrinks, intelligence will scale. Some of this will be useful. A humane technological order could reduce pointless labor, help doctors heal, help teachers teach, help governments waste less, help parents survive bureaucracy, help old people remain independent, help workers escape drudgery. But automation becomes false when it is asked to replace continuity. AI cannot give a child cousins. It cannot make an old woman feel remembered by a son. It cannot repair the trust between men and women. It cannot turn erotic consumption into covenant. It cannot bless the unborn. It cannot make a people love time again. It may preserve output while the world grows spiritually sterile. That is not salvation. The third false exit is cynicism. Cynicism says, do not be fooled again. Do not trust family, nation, religion, love, technology, politics, art, or hope. Every noble word has been used by liars. Every institution hides interest. Every prophet wants a platform. Every parent wounds. Every lover leaves. Every revolution becomes management. Every prayer passes through a nervous system. Every child is born into debt. The cynic is often right in parts and wrong in total. Cynicism is useful as acid. It dissolves falsehood. But acid is not soil. Nothing grows in a civilization that has made cynicism its final wisdom. The task is not to return to innocence. The task is post-cynical fertility. To know the fraud and still build. To know the wound and still bless. To know the conditions and still speak. To know the risks and still love. To know that the future is dark and still prepare a room. 7. Fertility beyond biology. It is necessary to say this plainly. The opposite of sterility is not reproduction alone. A person can have children and remain spiritually sterile. Parents can refuse to bless. Families can transmit fear, resentment, vanity, ideology, cruelty, and emptiness. Nations can produce babies for war. Movements can romanticize birth while despising the actual burden of care. And a person without children can be profoundly fertile. Some bear children. Some make the world more bearable for children. The teacher who awakens a student's mind participates in fertility. The uncle who shows up participates in fertility. The gay man who builds a house of welcome participates in fertility. The artist who preserves language participates in fertility. The nurse who cares for the old participates in fertility. The immigrant who enters a country and makes covenant with it participates in fertility. The priest who blesses without manipulation participates in fertility. The friend who keeps another person alive participates in fertility. The writer who gives form to pain so others do not drown in it participates in fertility. Fertility is transmissive love. It is the power to receive life and hand it forward in some form less damaged than it arrived. This matters because any serious meditation on fertility must avoid turning the childless into scapegoats. Many people do not have children because of infertility, illness, vocation, circumstance, loss, sexuality, late timing, economic pressure, loneliness, or wounds they did not choose. A spiritually fertile civilization does not humiliate them. It finds ways for their love to become generative. Indeed, one mark of a fertile society is that parenthood is honored without making the non-parent useless. Children need more than parents. They need aunts, uncles, neighbors, teachers, elders, mentors, artists, doctors, coaches, friends, strangers who make the streets safe, citizens who pay for schools, writers who protect language, and communities that understand childhood as a public trust. The sterile imagination reduces fertility either to biology or to lifestyle. The fertile imagination sees it as a whole posture toward life. A room can be prepared in many ways. A child may sleep there. A student may learn there. A friend may recover there. A dying parent may be held there. A sentence may be written there that helps another person continue. The question is not only, did you reproduce? The question is, did life become more receivable because you were here? 8. Post-cynical benediction. Hope, if it comes, will not come as innocence. The old innocence is gone. It may never have existed as purely as memory suggests. We know too much now, or think we do. We know about empire, trauma, propaganda, patriarchy, extraction, fraud, addiction, algorithms, institutional hypocrisy, family wounds, religious abuse, ecological fragility, technological manipulation, and the countless ways noble language has been used to decorate domination. This knowledge cannot be unlearned, nor should it be. The task is not to become naive again. The task is to recover the power of benediction after knowledge. A post-cynical benediction is not optimism. Optimism says the future will probably be fine. Benediction says the future is not guaranteed and must still be blessed. It is the teacher who knows the system is broken and still refuses to treat the child as waste. It is the parent who knows the world is dangerous and still sings at bedtime. It is the city that knows budgets are strained and still builds for strollers, wheelchairs, shade, libraries, and old men who need somewhere to sit. It is the writer who knows language is compromised and still refuses to make every sentence ash. It is the lover who knows bodies fail and still touches with tenderness. It is the citizen who knows the nation has sinned and still refuses to surrender it to those who only exploit or despise it. It is the addict who knows relapse is possible and still builds the mast. It is the childless person who knows grief and still becomes shelter. It is the old person who knows death is near and still blesses the young without envy. It is the wounded person who refuses to make the wound the final law. This is not grand. Much of it will look ordinary. A meal, a walk, a repaired institution, a child welcomed, a phone put away, a room cleaned, a student encouraged, a father forgiven imperfectly, a mother called, a body cared for, a sentence written without contempt, a future person considered before the appetite of the present. Civilizations do not become fertile again only through slogans. They become fertile through thousands of restored permissions. Permission to love without irony, to have children without being mocked as naive, to remain childless without being treated as barren, to inherit without denying sin, to build without certainty, to use technology without worshipping it, to critique without sterilizing, to speak sacred words without turning them into brands, to bless what one cannot control. The writer I encountered, the one who could not bless, remains in my mind. I do not hate him. Hatred would be too easy and would secretly imitate the sterility I am trying to name. Perhaps he is only more honest than the rest of us about a wound many people carry. Perhaps his fragments are not the disease, but the symptom. Perhaps a civilization that has lied too often produces people who would rather make ruins clever than risk being deceived by beauty again. I understand that. But understanding is not surrender. The fact that false grandeur exists does not mean grandeur is false. The fact that prayers pass through wounded nervous systems does not mean prayer is only wound. The fact that children enter a broken world does not mean birth is cruelty. The fact that language is compromised does not mean silence is pure. The fact that love can fail does not mean love has been refuted. A people is not saved when it forgets the darkness. It is saved when, having seen the darkness clearly, it can still prepare a room for someone yet to arrive. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.